President, I too rise to speak on this motion, in support of this motion. So often in this chamber, we talk about statistics, we talk about numbers, but we don't always talk about people. And what I'd like to talk about today in support of this motion is the last 20 years of my life, which actually, while I didn't serve in Afghanistan, what happened in Afghanistan in 2001 and subsequently through to this year has certainly been a reoccurring theme in my life, and I'd like to share that with the chamber today because I believe it reflects the service but also the support of so many Australians. And unlike what we've just heard in the chamber from previous speakers, I believe how Australia has responded to the World Trade Tower, the Pentagon, and all the aircraft that were downed during those attacks, right through to today, I think really shows the best of Australians. And our response over that 20 years shows us that Australia is a strong nation, we are a compassionate nation, and we are good people, and we are generous, and we are welcoming. So my journey with Afghanistan started with the bombing of the World Trade Towers. I was Chief of Staff to the Minister of Justice and Customs at the time, and if you will recall, the Prime Minister was actually in Washington on the day. And like everybody in this chamber who is old enough to remember that footage and those events, we watched with horror and incredulity at the images of those passenger aircraft deliberately being flown into towers, into the Pentagon and into the ground. And the first question for all of us as we gathered here in the building to assess what it all meant was, where is our Prime Minister? Is he alive? And is he safe? And once we'd ascertained that, it was all about, we quickly pivoted to being all about the response. What do we need to do for Australia, and what do we need to do with our like-minded partners globally? And just to remind people the impact, nearly 3,000 people from many, many nations were killed on that day, and that included 10 Australians. And very quickly on the 14th of September, Australia invoked Article 4 of the ANZUS Treaty. And for the following 20 years, we conducted 2 operations in Afghanistan continuously. The first, from November 2001 to December 2014, was Operation Slipper, and that was followed by Operation High Road from January 2015 to mid-2021, when the last of our ADF personnel withdrew from Afghanistan. And in total, over those nearly 20 years, 39,000 of our servicemen and women, full-time, part-time, Army, Air Force and Navy, served in Afghanistan, and also in support of those who were actually in country in Afghanistan. And at its peak of our military deployment, we had 1,500 personnel based there at any one time. But tragically, we also lost 41 Australian service personnel who came home in coffins to grieving families. And as a nation, we will always commemorate their service and thank their families and support their families who still grieve to this day. But tens of thousands of Afghan citizens also lost their lives over those 20 years. 260 Australians returned home seriously wounded, and many thousands more returned home with injuries that weren't as visible, with mental health issues that still are with many of them today. So when you listen to, as Senator Wong, I think very eloquently, and also Senator Birmingham very eloquently summed up the impact over the last 12 months of the return of the Taliban, I think it's worth reflecting on a few things and asking us the question, was it really all worth it? And I would say absolutely yes, it was worth it. For those who have not heard the saying, the Taliban have a strategy which is encapsulated in the saying that you have the watches and we have the time, which reflects their strategy of waiting out foreign forces in their nation. And that is clearly what we saw 12 months ago again. So was it worth it? And I know that that is something that many service personnel who have returned and their family members of those who have returned, but those who have returned home with lifelong wounds. And as I said, I would like to say that I believe that it has been. When you have a look at what was achieved when the coalition forces were there, the proportion of girls attending secondary school rose from 6% to well over 40%. The proportion of boys attending secondary school rose from 18% to over 70%. Female literacy in 15 to 24-year-olds was 56%, which was up from 11% in 2001. And male literacy in the same age group rose from 46% to 74%. And previously being banned from higher education under the Taliban 20 years ago, by 2001, over 30% of university students were women. So coming through to the circumstances subsequent, I had the great privilege, as I said, while I didn't serve myself in Afghanistan, it was a recurring theme in my career and my life. I had the privilege as the Minister for Defence to visit Operation High Road in July 2019 and to meet the many men and women who were still serving there, and clearly serving there in conditions where there were still threats. There were still attacks on our accommodations, and it was still very dangerous flying in and flying out of Kabul. But yet they were there, they were in high spirits, and they could see the difference they were making every single day. And they were so proud of what they were doing in the community for community development, the schools they'd built, the people they'd educated, both service personnel, the carpenters, the builders, the girls. They made a lasting and enduring difference, and I hope that all of our service personnel, the 39,000, will remember that on this upcoming anniversary of the great things they did. But again, coming back to 1 year ago, almost 1 year ago today, the Taliban, true to their word, we had the clocks and they had the time, and they returned. And we've heard here today the devastating impacts and consequences of that. But again, what shows the best of Australians is that we joined with so many other like-minded countries to form an air bridge out of Hamid Karzai Airport. And we had 32 flights out of Hamid Karzai in the most challenging and difficult of circumstances. And we evacuated over 4,000 Afghan nationals during that time, part of 80,000 that were airlifted in total by other like-mindeds during that period. And like many people in this chamber and many people we know throughout this building and in the other place, many of us were working furiously to try and get out a whole range of people who needed to be evacuated. And I'd just like to share the story with the chamber of 16 of those 4,000 people who were evacuated in the most traumatic and difficult of circumstances out of Hamid Karzai Airport. On the 15th of August, I sent a message to my friend, Shukira Barakazai. And Shukriya had been an MP in the Afghan Parliament, and she had been an underground teacher under the Taliban, and she was also the survivor of a Taliban suicide attack, which again she emerged alive but terribly scarred mentally and physically through that experience. So I contacted her knowing that she was still in Kabul and asked her what I could do. Did she need any help to get out? Because clearly her life was in great danger. And she said to me, "No, I will be fine, but there are others that you need to help." And one of them, she said, was a young outspoken journalist whose name is Khalid Amiri, who she said was in immense trouble and was facing death threats from the Taliban, and he needed to be removed from Afghanistan so that some of the young voices, some of those young Afghans who have been educated and who are very supportive of a modern, free and democratic Afghanistan can come out to have, so that they can still have their voices heard. So on Twitter, I contacted Khalid, never having met him or communicated with him before. And that started an extraordinary chain of events, which again mirrored so many others, that Foreign Minister Marise Payne and her staff were working 24/7 on evacuating. And can I now just acknowledge Minister Payne at the time and also her staff, who did an extraordinary job to coordinate the activities, as did the Minister for Immigration, to get the visas and to get many of these people out. So with Khalid and his family, he was under threat. He was terrified. He has 4 sisters living at home with him, all who had been educated and were professional young women. He also had a married sister and brother who were also had their own children, between them 4 daughters and a son. And they were all under immediate threat. So I now have hundreds of WhatsApp messages about how we got their visas, how do we get them quickly, and then how do we get them to safety. And it was an extraordinary time. They got the visas, they left their home, they put on women's clothes so they wouldn't be identified. We tried to get them through the Taliban checkpoints into the French embassy. That didn't succeed. They then moved to Abbey Gate, and everybody has seen those pictures of thousands and thousands of people trying to get through Abbey Gate and over the fences. And they were very tense days and hours. But then I got a text message as I was leaving this chamber from Khalid, after I hadn't heard from him for hours. And he sent me a photo right on the wall of the Abbey Gate, and there I could see 2 Marines sitting there on the gate with other people around. I asked Khalid to give his phone to the Marine to see whether an Australian voice would help the Marine, help him and his family through to the Australian evacuation point. And wonderfully, this Marine, whose name I cannot mention, but who has been thanked, he came on the phone, and there was this Australian voice who asked him to take my word that these people had Australian visas. And he did. And he took Khalid, his mother and father, and 4 of his sisters to the Australian collection point. And then the rest of the process, as it unfolded, Khalid and his family getting on the C-17 at Al Minhad Air Base with the Australian soldiers, and then through to Howard Springs and now to Melbourne. Wonderfully, his brother and sister and their families are now also reunited with them in Melbourne. They will be extraordinary Australians, and it is their stories of these 16 members of the Amiri family, plus everybody else out who we were able to get out and who we are supporting today, because they, along with the 80,000, are the future. They are the future of Afghanistan. It is our great hope that they will be able to return to Afghanistan and that the Taliban will once again fall. But in the meantime, they are here in Australia. The girls are studying. They will be great contributors to the Australian economy, but their nieces in particular will have a very different future. And whether they become Australian citizens and stay here, or whether they are able to return to Afghanistan, I think they demonstrate that it was worth it. And I hope in those stories and the stories of every other Afghan who has been ripped from their nation, and coming to Australia or elsewhere, that our servicemen and women and the families of those who were killed will find great solace
Senator Still
in
John.
that. Thank you.